events of 9/11. The next subheading is the neoconservatives and the great taboo. In order to initiate the process that sociologist James Petrus has identified as the post-9/11 globalization of Zionist power, and in order for the Israeli right to be able to dictate the terms of US Middle East policy, they would have to cultivate US-based proxies to do their dirty work. This group of US-based assets would be known as the neoconservatives, led by pro-Israel zealots such as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, both of whom were charged in the 1980s with passing classified documents to Israel. These are Israeli empire builders, I would submit, not American empire builders. Whilst the phrase neoconservative has entered the lexicon of most discerning citizens, there is amazingly little consciousness of this movement's genesis and core motivations. This is another area where analysts typically hide behind what Cyrus Biner has called the popular myth of a war for oil scenario, by invoking abstract generalizations such as the American empire or war for oil or military-industrial complex. Many analysts have been able to avoid engaging in what Peter Dale Scott has termed deep political analysis of what Scott identifies as the competing cabals in the US imperial system. The epithet neoconservative was coined by a left-wing political scientist named Michael Harrington to describe those on the left who in the 1960s and 70s were gravitating to the right of the political spectrum in US politics. Stephen Snigoski opines, many of the first generation of neoconservatives were originally liberal Democrats or even socialists and Marxists, often Trotskyites. Think of like Christopher Hitchens. Most originated in New York, and most were Jews. They drifted to the right in the 1960s and 70s as the Democrat Party moved to the anti-war McGovernite left. The great taboo, I would submit, which hinders most analyses of the 9/11 wars, is acknowledging the empirical fact that a preponderance of neoconservatives were Zionist Jews who supported Likudnik strategies for Middle East destabilization. Calais Lassen, editor of the Vancouver-based Adbusters, was traduced as anti-Semitic when he wrote an article in March 2004 entitled "Why Won't They Say They're Jewish?", in which he opined the neocon community is predominantly made up of people and organizations with a pro-Zionist perspective. The point is simply that the neocons seem to have a special affinity for Israel that influences their political thinking and consequently American foreign policy. It's fascinating to see how many books you can see in bookstores that focus on like Rumsfeld, Cheney and Bush, like the three main people in the US government who weren't Zionist Jews. And if you look at the rest of the neocons, like the people who Dr. Barrett drew attention to, the rest appear to be of that persuasion. So writer Edward Shapiro, himself of Jewish ethnicity, provides historical depth to Lassen's analysis of the neocons. Shapiro writes, many of the leading neoconservative intellectuals were Jewish academicians who moved to the right in the 1960s in response to campus unrest, the New Left, the counterculture, the Black Power movement, and the excesses of the Great Society and the hostility of the left to Israel. The left, so basically the left was a vehicle as long as it was like not hurting Israel, but then it was abandoned. So, you know, as a Marxist, I'm obviously interested in that. Mark Gerson, a perceptive student of the neoconservatives, has written that the left was distinctly bad for Jews. Gal Beckerman wrote in the Jewish newspaper The Forward, it is a fact that political philosophy, neoconservatism, was born among the Jewish immigrants and is now largely the intellectual domain of those immigrants' grandchildren. If there is an intellectual movement in America whose invention Jews can lay sole claim to, neoconservatism is it, Beckerman writes, and Beckerman continues, neoconservative has more than anything else historically specified two major political transformations, two conversions if you like, that took place over the past 40 years. The first one occurred when a small group of liberal Jewish intellectuals in the 1960s and 70s found themselves disgusted with the culture and politics of the New Left, beginning to move rightward. As the alienation from the left increased, they eventually found themselves allied with the anti-communists of the traditional right and began adopting some of the right's other assumptions. The second transformation was the eclipsing by these new conservatives with their aggressive views on foreign policy of the older conservative establishment, so they supplanted them. The so-called paleo-conservatives were defenestrated by the neocons. That revolution came to fruition with the presidential election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and with the words that began flowing from the current president's mouth in the days and months following the attacks of September 11th, 2001. That was Beckerman's words, not mine. Benjamin Ginsberg writes of the neocons, one major factor that drew them to the right was their attachment to Israel and their growing frustration with the 1960s, in the 1960s with the Democrat Party, that was becoming increasingly opposed to American military preparedness and increasingly enamored with third world causes, such as Palestinian rights. In the Reaganite rights, hardline anti-communism, commitment to American military strength, and a willingness to intervene politically and militarily in affairs, neocons founded a political movement that would guarantee Israel's security. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt of the University of Chicago and Harvard, in their seminal text, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which I would say all 9/11 truthers ought to read, they said they acknowledge the existence of non-Jewish members of the neoconservative movement, but they also write, Jews none the left comprise the core of the neoconservative movement. So I mean, I'm saying, like, you think of all the British imperialists around the world, whether they were in Malaysia or Canada or Australia, to say that their Britishness united them is not a controversial point, but then you say that perhaps people in the neoconservative movement, Jonathan Kay, David Frum, Netanyahu, that they're united by their Jewishness. I mean, like, ethnicity is a real phenomenon. I don't think I'm being racist by quoting these people who've drawn attention to the fact that a preponderance of the neocons were Jewish. I don't think that's racist. In fact, I think it's anti-racist because it's being invoked to oppose genocidal racist wars of aggression in the Middle East. To mention the Jewishness of the leading protagonists of the neoconservative movement, I write, should be no more or less taboo than mentioning the Cuban identity of those many Cuban emigre terrorists who worked with the CIA to sabotage the Cuban Revolution after Cuba's liberation from US domination in 1959. It wasn't the fact that these CIA-backed terrorists were Cuban that made them reprehensible. It was the fact that they had a warped militant anti-communist ideology that made the right-wing ethnic political faction repugnant to many. Likewise, with the neoconservatives, it's not the fact that most of their protagonists are Jewish which matters particularly. It's the fact that they have a militant imperialist Zionist ideology, and it's that warrants critical scrutiny. Indeed, the fatal error is to conflate Jews with the close-knit, often intermarried Likudnik Zionists who orchestrated the 9/11 wars. The American Jewish Committee's 2002 annual survey on Jewish opinion showed, that many Jews were against the Iraq War. I see Professor Fetzer giving me the... Okay, so we saw those statistics with Dr. Barrett. So obviously more than 50% of Jews were actually against the Iraq War. The neocons are very incestuous and are indeed a cabal. The Gulf War #1 is an illustration of the tension between the traditional realists and neoconservative hawks is the next subtitle. The arguments and fissures which arose during the events of Gulf War #1 between the nascent neoconservatives and the entrenched US foreign policy establishment highlight the stark differences between the pre-9/11 and post-9/11 palatability of the neocons' agenda. The US traditional foreign policy towards the Middle East was one of promoting stability for oil markets. Stability was best achieved for US informal empire builders by propping up local dictators rather than invading and occupying Middle East countries with the kind of formal empire building tactics of old European empires. In the technical jargon in international relations, this is called offshore balancing, where you basically do informal empire building, and unless there's instability, you kind of just prop up existing regimes. So a good example of offshore balancing was when a hegemon emerged in Europe, i.e. the Nazis. You saw the US do the Lend-Lease agreement to try and create stability in Europe. So that's the traditional foreign policy of the US in relation to the Middle East. I mean, you have to ask yourself, how many Middle Eastern countries did the US invade during the Cold War under the Eisenhower Doctrine? Syria briefly, Lebanon briefly, but basically, and Gulf War #1. But other than that, it was a policy of trying to foment stability by sponsoring competing states, not trying to weaken them through instability like the Zionists want to do. And so the approach of the US of buttressing Arab strongmen went against the interests of the Likudnik postmodern empire builders in Israel, who sought to balkanize the Middle East ensemble, breaking it down into small fiefdoms or ethno-religious statelets, so as to affirm Israeli hegemony in the region. From the perspective of big oil, balkanization and civil war was counterintuitive and likely to destabilize oil markets. And I quote Jonathan Cook affirming that. And I then go on to quote Susan Lindau, who of course just showed us why it's irrational from a US national interest to have to to go and invade and destabilize Iraq, because of course the US is exactly that. It's an American empire. It's an empire. It has market imperialism through which you can influence, it has a lot of clout through which you can influence these states such as Iraq. And so I went on to quote Susan Lindau. So I then have a chapter called The Schism in the Empire Begins. The 1970s were characterized by US concerns with the Ba'ath Party of Iraq, which promoted a form of pan-Arabism and socialism, and which maintained warm relations with the Soviet Union, as symbolized by the 15-year Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation Iraq signed with the Soviet Union. Iraq's pro-Soviet posture in the 1970s resulted in the US sponsoring the Shah of Iran as a counterweight in the region. The US funneled weapons and funds to the Shah of Iran, who was installed in a CIA-backed coup in 1953. The US Middle East policy was compelled to shift considerably once the Shah was ousted in 1979 in order for oil profits and stability in the region to be maintained. When the Iraqi government, led by Saddam Hussein, launched an attack on Iran in 1980, the US traditional foreign policy establishment encouraged US politicians to lend support to the Iraqi government. As of 1982, Iraq was no longer classified as a terrorist state by the US, and in 1983, the US government, fearful of an Iranian victory against Iraq and the destabilization of the Middle East, started to provide material aid to the Iraqi regime. The US provided Iraq with military equipment, agricultural credits, and logistical intelligence information, helping them locate the Iranian enemy. The US sent a vast armada of vessels to the Gulf, its largest deployment since the Vietnam War. These naval vessels were ostensibly deployed to ensure the security of oil tankers once in the region engaged in combat with naval vessels. Despite various atrocities being committed by the Iraqi government during this period, and despite Iraq's anti-Israel stances, the US government remained steadfast in protecting what it conceived of as its economic interests by sponsoring Saddam Hussein. The US policy of supporting Iraq was disdained by the government of Israel, which perceived Iraq to be enemy number one in the region. Israel's fear of the Iraqi government was illustrated in the bombing of the Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981, which Israel claimed was a nuclear weapons manufacturing plant. Israel, during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, deviated markedly in its Middle East policy from the policy of the traditional foreign policy establishment, and began to sell war materials to Iran. This represented a significant but often downplayed chasm in the US-Israeli imperial relationship. Snigosky sums up the Israeli government's logic. Israel's support for Iran reflected the long-held Israeli policy of supporting the periphery in the Middle Eastern world against Israel's closer neighbors. Being farther away, Iran was perceived as a much lesser danger to Israel than Iraq. As long as Iraq was involved in this prolonged conflict, it could not join Syria or Jordan to pose a danger to Israel's eastern border. Moreover, Israel's goal was to facilitate the drawn-out war of attrition in which both of its enemies would exhaust one another. Israel's perception of Iran as a natural ally against the Arab regimes hostile to the Zionist enterprise led to the conspiracy amongst Israelis and elements of the National Security Council in the 1985-1986 period, known as the Iran-Contra scandal. The Iran-Contra debacle was facilitated to a large extent by the covert workings of neoconservatives. Neocon Michael Ledeen effectively facilitated the covert dealings after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres in May 1985. Robert Dreyfus, author of Devil Games, has basically drawn attention to the fact that neoconservatives were influential on the Reagan regime, on the Reagan government. And so there are quite a lot I want to draw attention to still, so if I could just have a few more minutes. With the exposing of the criminal Iran-Contra conspiracy and with the US foreign policy establishment promoting what it perceived as US interests over the regional power Israel, there was clearly still a long way to go before the Likudnik neocon axis would be able to make the US follow the Israelo-centric line on Middle East affairs. With the culmination of the Iran-Iraq War in August 1988, and with George H.W. Bush, an oil man, coming to power in 1989, the Israeli hopes of destroying Iraq were dashed, as Bush pursued a collaborative relationship with the Iraqi government for the sake of maintaining stability for oil markets. Bush continued the provision of agricultural credits, military hardware, and advanced technology to Iraq that had begun under the Reagan administration. While a strong, stable Iraq was good from the perspective of oil barons, such as Bush Sr., who wanted a balance of power in the region, it was disastrous from the perspective of the Israeli empire builders. Adding to the woes of Israel's hegemons and their US-based neocon agents was that Bush's attempt to get serious with resolving the Israel-Palestine impasse. The PLO had recognized the existence of the Jewish state in Palestine in 1988 and had demonstrated a willingness to negotiate with Likud leader Yitzhak Shamir, who had no aspiration to decolonize the West Bank and Gaza, which he viewed as his God-given real estate. Israel, with its expansionist pretensions and permanent war economy, wasn't prepared to tolerate what Israeli strategic analyst Avner Yaniv referred to laconically as the PLO's peace offensive. We have to foil these dastardly peace offensives of the Palestinians. On January 14, 1990, the Likud Prime Minister declared the mass immigration of Soviet Jewry to Israel had justified the lands conquered in 1967. They wanted Lebensraum. In response to this, on March 1st, 1990, Secretary of State James Baker informed the Israeli government that American loan guarantees were to be contingent on the removal of illegal Israeli settlements from the West Bank. So the American government are actually telling Israel what to do for once. On March 3rd, Bush then introduced more conditions for loan guarantees, including the retraction of all Jewish settlements from East Jerusalem. Shamir, as would be expected, rejected the US government's proposals, while Israel's apologists in the North American media set about demonizing the US president for putting the interests of the big oil-oriented elite over those of the Israelocentric elite. William Safire denounced President Bush in the New York Times as less sympathetic to Israel's concerns than any US president in 4 decades since the nation's birth. This is the first administration to openly threaten to cut aid to Israel. This is also the first administration to tie aid directly to Israel's willingness to conform to US policy demands. Unless the West Bank is barred to Jews who want to move there, no loan guarantees to help the Soviet Jews start new lives will be given to them.
Josh, we want to have a question.
Okay, man, I'm just getting there. So basically, I'm drawing attention to how the traditional US foreign policy establishment, as personified by George Bush Sr., actually started telling Israel what to do in the 1980s, and as a result, the neocons realized that they weren't getting their plan brought into fruition, and I could, yeah, so I suppose I should have finished there. Yeah, it's enough, okay. All right, thanks very much. Yeah.